The year is 1890, and the air in Mr. Alistair Sterling's Pittsburgh mansion is as heavy as the steel that built his fortune. In the grand dining room, a suffocating silence has fallen over the table of industrialists, men whose faces are as hard as the metal they forge. The mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, reflects the cold light of the crystal chandelier, but offers no warmth. Outside, a persistent autumn rain streaks down the tall, imposing windows, blurring the distant glow of the city's mills. The scent of roasted duck and expensive wine hangs in the air, soured by a sudden, palpable tension. Wealth is everywhere, in the European porcelain and the heavy velvet drapes, yet the room feels like a gilded cage, its master the loneliest occupant. Tonight, that cage has become an arena, and an accusation hangs in the air, more chilling than the evening draught. The source of the discord stands near the service door. Eleanor Vance, a housemaid of only 22, is the still point in the swirling storm of suspicion. Moments ago, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, had declared that a priceless heirloom, Mr. Sterling's late mother's diamond brooch, was missing. With a voice dripping with feigned regret and a finger that trembled with malicious certainty, she had pointed directly at Eleanor. The other servants shrank back, but Eleanor stood her ground. Dressed in the simple, severe black and white of her station, she looked small against the room's grandeur. Her hands, calloused from endless work, were clasped calmly in front of her. But it was her eyes that held everyone captive. They were clear, steady, and held no trace of fear, only a quiet, unwavering dignity that seemed to defy the very foundations of this house. While the guests murmured and Mrs. Gable preened, expecting a tearful confession, Eleanor spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried across the silent room with perfect clarity. She did not address the accusation of theft directly. Instead, she calmly turned her gaze to the head housekeeper and pointed out a simple fact. She reminded Mrs. Gable that she herself had been polishing the silver in the morning room when the brooch was last seen on the mantel, and that she had been instructed to fold and put away the fresh linens in the small drawers of the secretary desk. Eleanor suggested, with unshakable logic, that perhaps in her haste Mrs. Gable had accidentally swept the small, delicate pin into a drawer along with a lace doily. It was not an accusation, but a simple, logical reconstruction of events, delivered with a grace that shamed the chaos around her. A younger footman was dispatched, his footsteps echoing nervously on the marble floors as he went to the morning room. The industrialists at the table shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the composed young maid and the now panicked head housekeeper. From his seat at the head of the table, Alistair Sterling watched it all unfold, his expression unreadable. He had barely noticed this girl before, another silent figure moving through the halls of his life. But now he saw her. He saw the sharp intelligence in her eyes, the resilient spirit that refused to be broken by a cruel and baseless charge. The footman returned, his face pale, holding the glittering diamond brooch in his open palm. A collective sigh swept the room, but Mr. Sterling heard none of it. He was watching Eleanor, who simply gave a small, respectful nod, her honor restored not by a plea for mercy, but by the undeniable power of her own quiet competence. It is in these moments, when a single act of courage can change the course of a life, that we are reminded of why such stories must be shared. If you believe in the power of these truths, your subscription helps us to keep bringing them to light. The silence that followed the discovery of the brooch was a different kind of silence. It was not the heavy, oppressive quiet of a lonely house, but a thoughtful, shifting one. In the days that followed, Alistair Sterling found his thoughts returning, again and again, to the image of Eleanor Vance standing in his dining room. He saw her not as a fixture of the house, but as a person of substance, a woman who possessed a quiet strength that his wealth could never purchase. He walked the long, empty halls of his mansion, his footsteps echoing on the marble, and saw the world he had built for what it was, a gilded cage, meticulously constructed, but devoid of life. The memory of his late wife was a faint perfume of duty and societal expectation, but the image of Eleanor's unwavering gaze was a sudden, sharp jolt of something real and vital. He began to look for reasons to speak with her, creating small, plausible tasks that required her presence in his study. At first, it was about the household ledgers, a pretense of checking for discrepancies in the accounts. He would sit behind his massive mahogany desk, a fortress of commerce and power, and she would stand before it, her hands clasped, her expression respectfully neutral. He'd ask her a question about an expenditure for linens or soap, and she would answer with a clarity and precision that impressed him. Her knowledge of the household's inner workings was encyclopedic, but it was the intelligence behind the facts that captivated him. He was a man accustomed to dealing with titans of industry, yet he found himself more intrigued by these brief, formal conversations with his housemaid. During one such meeting, under the guise of discussing the staff's welfare, he gently inquired about her past. He asked where she was from, a simple question that held no threat. Eleanor's response was delivered without a trace of self-pity, a stark and simple account of a life forged in hardship. She spoke of the Pittsburgh orphanage where she was raised, a place of grey walls, thin blankets, and the constant, dull ache of hunger. She described the regimented days, the endless chores, and the rare, treasured moments of kindness from a single overworked matron. She did not tell the story to elicit sympathy, but simply to state the facts of her existence. For Eleanor, survival had been a full-time occupation, leaving no room for bitterness, only a pragmatic and resilient spirit that had learned to find dignity in labor. Hearing her story, Mr. Sterling felt a profound sense of shame. His own life, with its manufactured pressures and inherited burdens, seemed hollow and insignificant in comparison. He had commanded armies of men in his steel mills, negotiated deals that shaped the city's skyline, and amassed a fortune that could last for generations, yet he had never faced a fraction of the adversity this young woman had endured with such grace. He looked at her hands, calloused and worn from years of scrubbing floors and mending clothes, and saw more honor in them than in all the soft, manicured hands he shook at his gentleman's club. Her poverty was a condition of her birth, not a reflection of her character. In fact, her character had been tempered into something unbreakable by the very fires that should have consumed her. This realization marked the beginning of a profound internal shift for Alistair. The rigid social structure he had always accepted as an immutable law of nature began to feel like a cruel and arbitrary prison. He was the master of this house, a king in his own domain, yet he was bound by invisible chains of convention, while Eleanor, who owned nothing, possessed a freedom of spirit he deeply envied. He found himself thinking less about profit margins and railway contracts and more about the simple authenticity she represented. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for years began to feel less like a chronic condition and more like a choice he was no longer willing to make. He was a man awakening from a long, gilded slumber, and Eleanor Vance was the unexpected light that had pierced the darkness. It is in these moments of quiet revolution, when a heart dares to defy a lifetime of rules, that we are reminded of the stories that truly matter. When one person sees the true worth of another beyond the labels society imposes, a powerful change begins. By subscribing, you help us ensure these powerful testimonies of the human spirit are never lost to silence. The library became their sanctuary. It was the one room in the house that felt more like a repository of ideas than a display of wealth. One afternoon, While Eleanor was quietly dusting the leather-bound volumes, he found himself unable to maintain the pretense of their station. He was holding a book of poetry, its pages filled with words about truth and beauty, and the irony was not lost on him. He turned to her, the book held open in his hand, and in a voice softer than he intended, he asked if she enjoyed reading. Her eyes lit up with a genuine, unguarded enthusiasm that took his breath away. She confessed it was her greatest pleasure, though one she rarely had the time to indulge. In that moment, he made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. He gestured to the worn armchair by the fireplace, a place no servant had ever been permitted to sit. "Please," he said, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "Sit. Read this passage with me." Eleanor hesitated, a flicker of disbelief and fear in her eyes. It was a transgression beyond imagination, a violation of the unwritten laws that governed their world. But she saw the sincerity in his expression, a plea for connection that transcended their roles. Slowly, she moved to the chair and sat on its edge, as if ready to flee at a moment's notice. He pulled up another chair, creating an island of intimacy in the vast, silent room, and began to read aloud. The barrier between master and servant dissolved, replaced by the shared rhythm of the verse. Their clandestine meetings in the library became a regular occurrence. They spoke of books and ideas, of the world beyond the mansion's stone walls, and of their own quiet hopes. He discovered in her a keen intellect and a deep well of compassion. She, in turn, began to see past the formidable tycoon to the lonely, thoughtful man beneath. She treated him not as Mr. Sterling, the owner of half of Pittsburgh, but as Alistair, a man with a mind and a heart. For him, it was a revelation. No one had spoken to him with such directness and honesty in decades. He felt seen, truly seen, for the first time since he was a boy, before the weight of his family name had settled upon his shoulders. Their bond was forged not in romance, but in mutual respect and intellectual companionship. But such a radical departure from the established order could not go unnoticed. The house had eyes and ears, and whispers began to circulate like a contagion through the servants' quarters. Mrs. Gable, her initial humiliation curdling into a venomous resentment, became the chief architect of the rumors. She saw the closed library doors, the lingering conversations, and the subtle shift in Mr. Sterling's demeanor, and she twisted these observations into a salacious narrative of impropriety. She spoke in hushed tones to the other maids and footmen, planting seeds of scandal that grew quickly in the fertile ground of envy and boredom. The atmosphere in the house grew tense, the respectful silence replaced by a current of suspicion and judgment directed squarely at Eleanor. Soon, the gossip seeped beyond the estate's iron gates. A deliveryman overheard a conversation, a laundress shared a story with her sister, and before long, the tale of the steel magnate and his housemaid was the subject of quiet speculation in the city's social circles. At his club, Mr. Sterling began to notice a change. Conversations would halt when he approached. Longtime business associates would offer a curt nod instead of a warm handshake. The unspoken accusation hung in the air, thicker and more suffocating than the cigar smoke. The very society that had defined his existence was now turning against him, its judgment as cold and hard as the steel from his mills. He was being tested, forced to weigh his entire life's work against a connection that had just begun to feel like salvation. Eleanor felt the shift most acutely. The other servants, who had once been her colleagues, now treated her with a mixture of fear and contempt. Her meals in the staff dining hall were taken in silence, her presence creating an immediate and uncomfortable void. Mrs. Gable took every opportunity to assign her the most demeaning and arduous tasks, her commands laced with a triumphant cruelty. Yet through it all, Eleanor maintained her quiet dignity. She performed her duties flawlessly, her head held high, refusing to give her tormentors the satisfaction of seeing her break. She understood the precariousness of her position, but her integrity was the one thing they could not take from her. The house had become a battleground, and she and Alistair were alone, standing against a rising tide of scandal and condemnation. The inevitable confrontation arrived on a grey Tuesday afternoon, the sky outside matching the cold stone of the mansion's facade. A delegation of 3 men, the city's most powerful industrialists and the local minister, were shown into the formal drawing room. They did not sit, but stood like a tribunal before the cold fireplace, their faces grim masks of self-righteous authority. They were the pillars of the society Alistair had always belonged to, the arbiters of its rigid code. Alistair faced them alone, the vast room feeling less like his home and more like an echo chamber for their silent, damning judgment. The minister, a man whose sermons on charity were famous, spoke first. His voice was smooth and practiced, yet it carried the unyielding hardness of a hammer striking an anvil. He spoke of propriety, of legacy, and of the dangerous scandal that threatened to tarnish the sterling name and, by extension, their entire community. At a subtle signal from the minister, Mrs. Gable appeared at the doorway, her expression a sickening blend of subservience and triumph. Behind her stood Eleanor, who had been summoned from her duties in the laundry. She was still in her simple work dress, her hands slightly damp, yet she walked into that room of immense power and wealth without a hint of trepidation. She stood a few feet behind Alistair, her gaze level, her presence a quiet defiance of their expectations. The men looked at her with undisguised contempt, seeing only a housemaid, a catalyst for chaos. The minister cleared his throat, preparing to deliver the final crushing blow of their ultimatum: dismiss the girl, restore order, and return to the fold. The air was thick with the unspoken threat of total social and financial ruin, a price they were certain he would never be willing to pay for a servant. But before Alistair could summon a response, before the minister could pronounce his verdict, Eleanor took a single, deliberate step forward. All eyes turned to her, a mixture of shock and irritation on the faces of the delegation. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it filled the cavernous room with an unshakable calm. She did not look at Alistair for protection. Instead, she addressed the men directly. She spoke not of herself, but of the nature of their judgment. She asked them if dignity was a garment that could only be purchased with wealth, or if honor was something that only existed within the walls of their gentlemen's clubs. She spoke of the hard, honest labor that built their city and reminded the minister that faith without works is dead. It was not a defense. It was a lesson in morality, delivered with a quiet authority that stripped them of their own. A stunned silence fell over the room. The men were speechless, their prepared speeches and righteous indignation rendered meaningless by the simple, profound truth of her words. In that moment, watching Eleanor stand against the world for the sake of her own integrity, Alistair felt the last of his gilded chains shatter and fall away. The fear that had haunted him for weeks, the fear of losing his status and his legacy, evaporated, replaced by a powerful, liberating clarity. He moved to her side, the simple act, a declaration more powerful than any words. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and protection, and faced the stunned delegation. "This woman," he said, his voice resonating with a conviction he hadn't felt in years, "is the most honorable person I have ever had the privilege to know, and she is not leaving. From this day forward, she will be the lady of this house." The pronouncement hung in the air, as shocking and final as a thunderclap. The minister's face turned a mottled shade of red, and the other men simply stared, their mouths agape. The world they knew, with its unshakable rules and rigid hierarchies, had just been turned upside down. Alistair did not wait for their sputtering protests. With a calm he had never known before, he walked to the heavy oak doors of the drawing room and opened them wide. "Your business here is concluded," he stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Leave my home." One by one, defeated and bewildered, the pillars of society filed out, their power utterly broken. As the great doors closed with a resounding thud, Alistair and Eleanor were left alone in the sudden, profound silence. The world outside was now their enemy, but within the walls of that room, they were finally, truly free. Their marriage was not a grand affair, celebrated in the city's cathedrals, but a quiet civil ceremony held in the very drawing room where they had declared their independence. It was an act of profound rebellion, a private vow that echoed louder than any society gossip. The backlash was immediate and severe, just as the delegation had threatened. Contracts were cancelled, credit lines were frozen, and the railroad magnates, who had once been Alistair's peers, refused to transport his steel. The Sterling Empire, built over generations, teetered on the brink of collapse. Yet, in the face of this ruin, Alistair felt no fear, only a strange and exhilarating freedom. He and Eleanor would spend their evenings in the library, not reading poetry, but poring over maps and ledgers. It was here that her practical, clear-eyed intelligence shone brightest, as she saw pathways and possibilities that his privileged perspective had always overlooked. The solution they devised was as simple as it was revolutionary. If the railroads, the arteries of industrial power, were closed to them, they would turn to the river, the city's ancient lifeblood. They invested their remaining capital into a fleet of river barges, creating a new transport system that was not only independent, but more efficient. Eleanor, whose entire life had been an exercise in maximizing limited resources, reorganized the mill's logistics with an expert's touch, streamlining schedules and cutting waste in ways Alistair's managers had never conceived. She worked alongside him, her sharp mind for numbers and human nature proving as valuable as his decades of experience. Together, they watched from the banks of the Monongahela as the first barges, laden with sterling steel, pushed off into the current, forging a new commercial route, born not of monopoly, but of sheer, unyielding will and shared ingenuity. Their success became a legend whispered among the smaller, independent producers who had long been suffocated by the industrial cabal. The Sterling's river route became a lifeline for many, breaking the stranglehold of the railroad barons and fostering a fairer marketplace. Alistair, once a ruthless competitor, was transformed. He found a deeper satisfaction in building alliances than in crushing rivals. He learned from Eleanor that true power was not about controlling others, but about creating opportunities, and that a legacy was measured not in tons of steel, but in the lives one managed to uplift. The mansion, once a monument to his loneliness, slowly filled with the warmth of genuine partnership. He was no longer Mr. Sterling, the steel tycoon, but Alistair, a man who had found his purpose and his happiness in the courageous heart of the woman he loved. 5 years later, the light that filled the Sterling estate was softer, warmer, and came not just from the chandeliers, but from the sound of laughter in the gardens. Alistair and Eleanor stood on the veranda, watching their 4-year-old daughter, Clara, chase butterflies across the lawn. The child, with her father's thoughtful eyes and her mother's resilient spirit, was the living embodiment of their victory, a future where character, not birthright, defined one's worth. The grand house was no longer a cage, but a home, its foundations rebuilt on the bedrock of respect and a love that had defied an entire world. Their story became a quiet testament to the truth that the most powerful revolutions often begin with a single act of seeing another person for who they truly are. It is for the sake of legacies like theirs, built on courage and love, that we must continue to share these accounts, and your subscription is what allows these essential human stories to endure.